Oh, man. Ooh, okay. So, if you would, I want to say, open your Bibles to the book of Job. And the passage is in Job 42, but really, there's a lot that for us to kind of go through before we get to Job 42. So you can kind of take your time getting there. This is a message that I knew for some time that this date was coming up, and as we were scheduling and talking about things, and over time I'd gotten this, and I was talking to my daughter the other day, and I had kind of told her, what I had titled the message. And she goes, "Oh wow, that's really neat." And when we went out for breakfast yesterday morning, I said, I changed the title. She chastised me. So I'll tell you the title that I was going with forever. It was going to be The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and the Truth. And I was like, man, then they're going to expect a Clint Eastwood to tie in there somewhere, and me and Miss Laura have been with the cold weather, you kind of watch the old westerns and stuff like that to pass the snowy days. And so I straight up just abandoned the title. And what did I do? But I went with something that's very cliche. It's New Year's resolution, right? So seeking the perfect resolution. But as any time that I get to share, one time if you've been here for a while, you know that I've handed out lollipops. One of the worst things I ever did was I handed out stones. And I thought, I didn't think that through. Because they could stone me by the end of this. But, and there was always these ties into the message, setting the memorial stone. The lollipop was the unwrap your salvation and find out what's inside. And so I got to this message, and I had been listening to, if any of you are familiar with a gentleman by the name of Ray Comfort. And Ray Comfort does a lot of street evangelism. If you ever watched the Left Behind series, or you read those books, that's the presentation of the gospel is actually Ray Comfort's method of, if you ever been guilty of any one of these sins, then you're guilty of one. And so Ray Comfort, I follow him on Twitter, and over the last month and a half or so, he's been posting passages out of the book of Job. And I was kind of reading over these things. I was like, that is really where, God wants me to be. And again, the good, the bad, and the ugly really fit with the message, but God was leading me to this. And although it might sound cliche, as we think about New Year's and New Year's resolutions, I want to challenge you to just listen to what God revealed to me and laid on my heart, and that it will encourage you and challenge you. And so, seeking the perfect resolution, and we'll get to that resolution because it's written in chapter 42. And if you're like me, when you get that kind of a hint, I'm left-handed, so if I sit in a doctor's office, I flip to the back of the magazine first and look through the magazine backwards. It's just a left-handed thing, I guess. But so now that we're going to be in the last part of that, eventually you might sneak and look at that. But I want to share some things with you. First thing is a definition to kind of get us started. And so, if you were to go to Merriam-Webster's, the internet, it'll pull up about 7 or 8 definitions. And I was humorously drawn to the one that said, definition of resolution for those learning English. And I thought, I'm still not trying to learn English. So I thought, well, I'll use that definition today. And it says, the act of finding an answer or solution to a conflict, problem, etc. It actually goes on, and it says, seeking, the act of seeking or resolving to have understanding of something. And, in our life today, we often get to a place where we're looking for resolutions. We want a New Year's resolution because we see a problem in our life and we want to bring about change, or we seek resolutions because there's something going on and we want to answer to why. All of these things can kind of happen, and essentially that's the process by which we enter into. We start looking for a resolution. How do we solve this? Even in politics and government, all those things, sometimes we'll hear resolutions that people come up with and they end up not being that great. I think about the whole hand sanitizer movement. How many of y'all do the hand sanitizer thing? They came out with a study and said, really, this is probably not good for us because we so de-germify ourselves that we end up being more susceptible to catch something. We come up with these solutions that we think are so wonderful, and then 15 years later we're like, well, that was a bad idea. that almost killed us. So I grew up in that age. I think it was Roy Minton posted on Facebook, and it said, how many of you grew up before seat belts, before child seats, before, and it goes through all these things, and it says, if you answered yes to these, that means you're still alive and you survived it. And I'm like, man, I remember that. My mom had she had a white Torino. You remember the Torino? And I was so little. And we had pulled up, and it was a ritual in our home, in our growing up, that my grandparents would come down off the mountain to get groceries. And my mom would drive my grandmother around, and they would do the whole coupons, and you got to go to this store, and we'd go to the Piggly Wiggly, and we'd go to Kroger, and I remember where all the old buildings were, and this guy pulls up in like a 1982 Trans Am. And my mom, she really wanted in that lane, because by the time you get up to where the Dairy Queen is and Pizza Inn, that used to be the old Cozart Warehouse. And that was, she wanted in that lane before you went under the railroad tracks. This guy kind of like jams in there, and he sits there, and it's my mom, her mother-in-law, my grandmother, and he's going, well, I'm like, woo, this is great. I get up in that seat, and I'm like, racy, Mom, racy. And she's like, sit down, be quiet, racy, Mom. That light turned green, and I was plastered to the back glass. Just like, hey, look at all those cars behind us, She tromped it, and that Ford Torino just, boom. And she got over in her slot, and I was like, greatest day of my 8-year-old life, we survive those things, and we get into these things where we say, oh, how did we survive that? We go back and we ask these questions of, how did I get through that? I want to tell you that God is looking out for us. But we struggle in the midst of those trials, in the midst of those situations, in the midst of those, heartaches, to see that. And I want to share with you this revelation, if you will, that God just kind of opened up to me in the book of Job. The first thing is we have conflicts in life. Now, chapter 1, the very first verse, Job is actually, his reputation is declared by God. It says, there was a man in the country of Uz named Job, who was a man of perfect integrity, who feared God and turned away from evil. It says in verse 8 that the Lord said to Satan, as we open up and get into the book, have you considered my servant Job? No one else on earth is like him, a man of perfect integrity, who fears God and turns away from evil. To say that on your resume that God speaks for the kind of person you are, That's amazing. And yet, if we really know the book of Job, a lot of us would say, yeah, I'd like to have God speaking on my behalf on my resume. But then when you find out the job, you're like, God, could you pick somebody else for that task? You don't have to recommend me. Let me recommend somebody else for you. God allows these things. God himself speaks to the integrity of Job, and God allows these trials. That word, Satan, that name, it actually means in the Hebrew language, the accuser. And even as God speaks to the integrity, speaks to the character of Job, it says that Satan accuses him. He accuses Job of why of his morality. He says to God, he only serves you and worships you because you bless him so. And you're going to find yourself accused in life. You're going to find yourself in these kind of situations. And listen, we face these conflicts in life, and we ask this kind of question: why do things happen to the innocent? I was watching the news, and if you know just a snapshot of what's going on in California, devastated by fires, and inevitably what happens with such damage to the agriculture, your soil is really, it's not over with the fires. What happens when it rains is there's nothing there to hold the ground in place. And they've had these massive mudslides. And I was watching the news about some of these rescues, and there was a gentleman that was interviewed, and he was just sobbing, and he was covered in mud, and he said we just heard a gurgle and a cry, and he said we went over there and we just reached down into the mud, just the soup, and pulled up an infant. That happened this week in California. They have no clue who the child is. Nobody knows anything about the family. And just sobbing, and they said they were able to just scoop the mud out of the mouth of this infant, and it was immediately handed off to EMS and carried away to the hospital. And you say, how does this happen? How does the bad things happen? And I'm going to be honest with you. If you're here today, most likely we can all come to a conclusion that good thing happens to bad people and bad things happen to good people. We can get to that, and we can even get to a place where we can cope with that. But I want you to understand that Job is able to teach us so much more. There's a logic that we use when we see things like this happen, and this is kind of a Wes Stringer definition, okay? Theology, what is it? And you can look up at all these people that are way more educated than me, far more learned than I, and they'll have all these deep definitions. I think mine's pretty good. Theology, it's humanity's attempt to understand God. Now, here's the thing about Job. By his own mouth, we'll get to this definition. Job is an ancient one, okay? When we start to learn about civilizations, when we start to look at what the Bible has to teach us about our origins, where we come from, Job, he predates the Israelites. One of the friends that comes to speak to him, he is a Temanite, and it says that he is from the certain land of Buzz, I believe, and you start reading these things and you find out that there's enough recorded history that says that this very well could be some of the descendants of, or not descendants, but ancestors of Abraham. That this was possibly a great uncle to Abraham's, family, the father of Abraham's brother, and you're like, wow, this is, so what I want you to get is, this is an ancient one. So where does if God speaks to his integrity, where does that come from? How does he know? You can read in the first couple chapters, and he would make sacrifices for his children, like just in case. They would have these great dinners and these great banquets, and Job would make sacrifices on their behalf. And we can see that as he gives testimony throughout the book, that he talks about how that he was a leader of the people, and that he would sit in the gates of the city, and that he was called upon to be a righteous judge, and that he would volunteer to be an advocate for the innocent, and he was constantly seeking out righteousness. Well, I want you to think of this. Where does that wisdom come from? Where does his knowledge of God come from? He's in that line that comes from Noah. That what he knows of God and sacrificing and being this minister, if you will, to his family and his community, it comes from his history. That's where we're at today. Our theology, if you will, it's our attempt to understand God, and oftentimes we try to understand God based on our history. Now, follow with me, if you will. He even admits to this later on, and we'll see it. But there's a handful of people that come into his life, and I want to look at some of these things that'll help us better understand the conclusions that they draw about why Job is going through these things in his life. The first is his family. We know that, and he has family that's mentioned in chapter 42, but certainly his wife. And oftentimes, I'll be the first to admit, I have kind of given Job's wife harsh treatment. And I have said that, man, I can't believe she was like that. But I got to back up and say, you know what? We learn about Job and we focus on Job, and he loses his family, he loses his children, he loses his servants, he loses his wealth and all of these things. So does she. And when we say, how do we come up with some of the resolutions, these ideas that we have about why these things happen, I think that her approach is valid. Considering everything that Job has lost, she has lost. When his children die, they're her children. When those servants are lost, it's that same part of their family that's lost. And so when she says, why don't you just curse God and die? It's the last part of, it's about the middle of chapter 2, verse 9. She says, do you still retain your integrity? Why don't you just curse God and die? And in reality, that curse God and die is translated for our benefit, because it actually, they were so reverent of God that they would say it in a snarky way. It was sarcastic. They would actually say, why don't you bless God and die? Because they didn't want to be held contemptible themselves. They didn't want to be held accountable for those things. And so it's translated for us to understand, but she says, why don't you just go ahead? Curse God and die. She speaks from this point of view that is comparable to bewilderment. She's in shock. And look at what he says. And we could finish, honestly, with this part right here. And every one of us would go out here and say, that's the approach we would all come to. That's the conclusion. He says, "You speak as a foolish woman speaks." He told her, "Should we accept only good from God and not adversity?" Throughout all of this, Job did not sin in what he said. And the reality is we would all say, that's a pretty good Christian. Lose everything and still have that mindset. He has these three friends that come to speak to him, and I've often held his friends in contempt too. And the reality is they genuinely weep with him for a week. They were sorrowful. And yet, I as much as I can identify with what his wife says, I can be honest with you, as church folk, we really can identify with what his three friends say. And this is why I say theology it's from man's perspective. It's from our finite view of an infinite God. And they do just that. They look at history and they say, well, this is what we've seen. This is what we've observed. This is what we know about God. And this is what we see happen. I mean, think about it. They look at things, Noah's account of the flood. All of man was wicked. God destroyed the earth. They look at the Tower of Babel. Man thought that he could be equal with God. So they were dispersed by languages. And they look at history and they say, this is who God is. There's sin and there's judgment. And they get this view of God based on what they can observe. And I want you to know that there's more to it than that. I want you to look at these three friends. These friends and peers, there's a desire in us to have answers. And that desire for us to have answers will lead us to make assumptions that are contrary to the truth. We can come up with wrong answers. There is a movement of people that they've decided, well, we don't have any concrete evidence that the earth is round. And there are these I think they're called flat earth. Have any of y'all heard of that? And you're like, well, that's just ludicrous. Get on a plane and fly once. And you're like, whoa, earth is round. You can see it. And yet there are people that will come up with these wrong ideas based on history. Look at Eliphaz. Eliphaz is this rationalist. And he wants to, you ever been in those situations where you're talking to somebody and you're like, man, I didn't know that was going on. I didn't know that you were sick, or I didn't know that happened about your job. And you're just making conversation. You're like, well, how did that happen? In our minds, we want to try to come up with a solution. Why did that happen? Why did that person get laid off? Why is that person sick? Why is all this going on? And we start to rationalize and we start to make an educated guess. Why did that happen? Well, this and this and this. Surely that's what the conclusion brought that to. We look at our history. And even if you don't do it in that conversation, you'll be driving home, you'll be around your family or friends, you'll be like, man, I was talking to so-and-so the other day, and what do you think about this idea? Yeah, that could be why that happened. It was this, it was that, it was government, it was a move from coal to natural gas. And we come up with all these sorts of solutions. And Eliphaz, he's this rationalist, and he says, man, we love you. They weep with him for a week. Their sincerity, it's genuine. And yet they want to come up with a solution. And he has this idea, surely there is something that you've done to deserve this. Don't we get to that place? We might never say it. We've thought it. We get to that place where we're like, man, how could that person, go through all of that? Surely they did something. Bildad, he's this apologetics. He's like, well, now, don't question God, and God has a purpose for all things, and surely there's a reasoning in all of this, and some things happen, and that's why this is coming. And he's trying to defend God in these things. And then there's Zophar, and Zophar is kind of like a prosecutor. Zophar, as much as he mourned for Job, he gets to a place like, you're a dirtbag, right? You're such a wicked, wicked person. And that's why this has happened to you. And Zophar goes from like, cheer up, buddy, the sun will come up tomorrow, to, man, you're just the wickedest man on the face of the earth. Zophar gets to a place where he not only mocks Job, he mocks his very words. He takes and turns them back around. You have little kids, and you say, "Go clean up your room. Go clean up your room." Oh, when that kid mocks you, you're like, oh. You find yourself in the back seat beyond the back seat. You're in the back dash of the Gran Torino. You find yourself not remembering what just happened. Zophar is this prosecutor, and he mocks Job. And in everything that his friends share with him, Job has a legitimate answer. He says, you accuse me of that, but that's not true. And he's able to give a defense. And his friends say, they're left with, man, he's right. There isn't a reason there. That's not why. He's able to say, you've asked these questions and you've made these accusations against me, and there's no truth in it. You want to know something? We see a lot of that in the world today. And we struggle to have an answer. And because we look at our history and we say, this is how things have to work, we miss what God has for us. And that is where the second definition comes in. I had to run the presentation last week, and as I was sitting back there, I struggled to see the screen. I was like, man, the screen's out of focus. Of course, most time I only wear one contact. We had a Sunday school meeting yesterday, and I was like, yeah. It was like 9 o'clock, hadn't had enough coffee yet, and I reached up there and I rubbed my eye, and I'm like, rubbed my contact right out, and I'm like, I can't see nothing. I had to go, put it in solution and all this stuff. That's why I'm wearing glasses today. This second definition for resolution, I think it really applies here. I was looking at that screen last week, and I was like, man, some of those words are fuzzy. It needs to be brought into focus. Resolution, the ability of a device to show an image clearly and with a lot of detail. See, there's so much more than just a New Year's resolution. There's so much more than just trying to find a solution or an answer to why something's happening. Resolution is that ability to see things more clearly, to bring them into focus. And there's this young man, Elihu, and he's young, and we don't even find out about him till halfway through the book. And he says, I sat here and I was quiet and I was respectful of my elders, and that's good. He needed to do that. And he goes, you guys are just wrong. He's like, how did y'all come up with these ideas? How did you come up with these things? And here's what he says. It's so fascinating. You need to read about his response. He says, I'm young and I don't have the wisdom you have, but I've let God speak to me. The Spirit that has led me to this place. And he says, I can't contain the words within me. He compares himself to an angel. That word can be translated as a messenger. He says, I'm here to share with you how you need to look at this. Elihu he's there to bring things into focus. And it's so amazing. He says, as I was studying this, I couldn't help but draw the comparison of Elihu to John the Baptist. Because John the Baptist he speaks to those Pharisees, those leaders, and he was there as a messenger to announce the coming Messiah. Now think about this. John the Baptist speaks to those Pharisees and he goes, y'all are a bunch of snakes. Y'all are a bunch of vipers. Woo. That's like, he didn't mince words. You're like, oh man, did you really just say that? Elihu is there and he says, you guys, you're so smart and full of wisdom, and you're wrong. You've missed it. Elihu is there to speak to Job and to say, listen, let God show you. Now, here's what happens. Elihu, he is preparing Job to see, and then God speaks. And I want you to know something. We need to learn this. God doesn't answer Job's questions. He doesn't respond to Job's accusations. But he says, Job, I'm going to ask you some questions. You have all these questions for me. I'm going to ask you questions. There's over 70 questions that God asks Job. And I mean fascinating stuff. He says, can you loosen Orion's belt? I mean, we have scientists that study the stars and they talk about how many thousands of light years it is between these stars that we look up and we see and we say, oh, they're just like that. No. Light years apart. He says, can you loosen Orion's belt? Can you widen it? He says, can you lead the bear and her cubs across the sky? That's the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the great bear and her cubs. He says, can you do that? He talks about his control over thunder and lightning and over the waters of the deep. He talks about all these things. He talks about Leviathan. He talks about Behemoth. He talks about all these creatures. He asks him, can you do these things? Can you control these things? Do you know the rising and setting of the sun and the moon? Can you, Job, it's awful quiet. Job, I'm not hearing you answer my questions. The reality is Job finds that his understanding of God was very human. It was very small. As great as God himself speaks of the integrity of Job, we have so much to learn, don't we? We have so much to understand, and you're going to go through things. You're going to go through problems, and I want you to understand, here's the message. All of that was to just say this. Job's point of view has always been human, but he changes Job's focus. I want you to look at chapter 42. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do anything, and no plan of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this who conceals my counsel with ignorance? Surely I spoke about things I did not understand. A man who, by God's own account, was full of integrity, didn't speak right about God. He says, I spoke about things I didn't understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now and I will speak. When I question you, you will inform me. Verse 5, if you take anything away from this, when you say, did I really learn anything about Job? Here it is. It's not chapter 2, verse 9 and 10. It's right here. He said, I had heard rumors about you. That's what I'm saying. Our theology, our history of understanding, we've heard a lot about God. Why are we in church today? It's tradition. There's things that we were brought up. When I got older and I had heard about churches meeting on Thursday, I was like, well, y'all are just weird. Because I'd been raised all my life. Church services met in the middle of the week. They met on Wednesday. That's, and you're like, well, that's just insanity. I've never heard of that. We base our knowledge of God on the history, on the lessons we've been taught. Look at what Job says. I'd heard rumors about you. The things he had heard were what made him this man of integrity, and yet he still didn't have a grasp of who God is. He says, but now my eyes have seen you. And what he's saying is he physically has heard the voice of God. And everything's different now. If God was to speak to us today, right now, we would tremble. Because we have nothing to compare it to. Job has never had anything as a standard to say this is God and this is what I compare everything I understand to. I heard rumors of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I take back my words and repent in dust and ashes. See, Job had a human point of view, and he was asking God, why have these things happened to me? And I want to tell you something. There's going to be things that happen to you in your life. There's things that I'll face one day in my own life. Things that are going to be difficult. You've faced things in your own life that are difficult, and yet the purpose. Look at this. After the Lord had finished speaking to Job. Now, remember this. Through the entire book, he gives an account of being this person that would make sacrifices on people's behalf. He was a person that was a defender of the weak, of the innocent. He would take up their causes, and he did that because of what he had been taught. It says, after the Lord had finished speaking to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz, I am angry with you and your two friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me. See, their picture of God was based on their history, on what they had seen, on their observations. And God says, you're wrong. This is who I am. He says, you've not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. See, now Job, he has an understanding of God that takes him to a different level. Takes him to a level where if before he was a minister because he'd been told, well, that's the right thing to do, now he has an understanding of God, and God says, Job can help you. It says, now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer a burnt offering for yourself. Then my servant Job will pray for you. I will surely accept his prayer and not deal with you as your folly deserves. Boy, don't we deserve a lot worse in our own lives? It says, for you have not spoken the truth about me as my servant Job has. Then Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar went and did as the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. And after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his prosperity and doubled his possessions, and all of his brothers and sisters and former acquaintances came to his house and dined with him. And they sympathized with him and comforted him concerning all the adversity the Lord had brought on him. And each one gave him a cuesta and a gold earring. It's an offering. Can you imagine the things that maybe you might struggle and you might never understand why you go through them? But if we'll trust in God, think about what Jesus said. He said, as he's departing, he's ascending into heaven, he says, I'll never leave you or forsake you. I'll be with you to the very end of the age. That means whatever you go through, we should never present the gospel to someone and say, man, if you accept Jesus Christ, life's going to be grand. Because actual truth, life would get a lot harder. But the retirement plan is exceptional. There's nothing better. There's nothing that will ever beat it. I've got this saying that my dad said years ago, and I wrote it down I've had this bookmark since I was probably about 15 or 16. It says, the best life insurance in the world is free. You can spend a lot of money trying to buy a place well, if I get cancer, I've got insurance, or if I get in a car wreck, I've got insurance. You can't buy what God has got for you. But it's a gift. It's something that when we really understand adversity, that with confidence and boldness, we can share that with the world. Because the world needs to hear about this man, Jesus, who will be with us through everything. Job repents. God corrects Job's peers. And Job ministers to them. The things you go through, there'll be a day. There's a reason. I don't know what it is. There'll be a day that you'll be there to hold somebody up. That you'll be there to say, I'm here and God brought me through this so that I could be here for you today. These are the things that we need to share. Job honors God with his life. It says in verse 14 of chapter 42, Job lived 140 years after this. He saw his children and their children to the fourth generation. And then Job died old and full of days. And can you imagine him today? What it's like. He would say, oh man, everything I went through was worth it. Everything that I suffered and endured was worth it. If you'd bow your heads and close your eyes, I think that if we would adopt Job's point of view, that if that was the resolution that we would have in our lives, that we could face the world and do far more for the kingdom of God. And certainly on this cold day, you can think of somebody. You might recall things in your own life. You might be going through things right now.